You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 5th of May, 2025, on Monocle Radio.
Israel decides it will reoccupy Gaza after all. But why? Germany prepares to swear in its new government, and Donald Trump declares trade war on foreign films. Surprising for such a big Robert Bresson fan. I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests Aliona, Hlivco and Quentin will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll have a report from Abu Dhabi's recently concluded Culture Summit. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I'm joined today by Aliona Hlivco, founder and CEO at St James Foreign Policy Group, and regular Monocle Radio contributor Quentin. Hello to you both.
Greetings.
Hello.
Aliona, first of all, you have been traipsing around Europe. Where have you been and why?
I have indeed. I tried to get away for Easter to go see my mom and my sister who live in Germany, so that was part of my trip. But then inevitably, as a young entrepreneur, I now try to pack in all the trips I had to make for clients and various projects. So I ended up going to Amsterdam, Luxembourg, and even up to Madrid, Madrid Open in Spain on Easter Monday. So it was a lot of traveling.
And Quentin, you have been elsewhere in Europe, travelling slightly less, but it is picturesque at least.
Yes, I went to Ireland for Easter to see my son and my granddaughter, and stayed up in the hills in Tipperary, which is a lovely part of the world, but it was quite sunny for a couple of days, and then it rained for the rest of the time.
Quentin, are you suggesting that it rained in Ireland?
It does, on and off.
I know, this is shocking news. But we will start the show proper in Israel, where it is being plausibly reported that Israel's government intends to do what it has spent 18 months saying it did not intend to do, and seize the Gaza Strip entire. Israel's security cabinet is said to have signed off on the plan, and the Israel Defense Forces have begun calling up tens of thousands of reservists. The plans, apparently scheduled to take several further months, include the pushing of Gaza's people into the south of the enclave but resuming humanitarian relief supplies, but to be distributed by private companies rather than by Hamas. Quentin, first of all, does this sound like we are getting any closer to any sort of end game than we have previously?
It certainly sounds as if the nightmare of Gaza is just going to carry on as a complete nightmare. I don't know that it does seem that we're getting close to an end game, because we've been told that this was an end game for an awful long time, and it has dragged on far longer, I think, than the Israelis ever expected it to. They said, we're going to smash Hamas. And of course, the tragedy of it all is that it's the civilians who are constantly getting caught in the middle of this. And so, I mean, it's going to take time to organise what they look to be organising, which is occupation of the whole of Gaza. And in the meantime, who is going to die of starvation? There is no aid getting through.
Well, indeed not, and there hasn't been since the ceasefire ended in March. Aliona, Hamas does still, of course, hold Israeli hostages, both alive and dead. Does this, despite what Israel's government is claiming, make the return of those hostages any likelier?
Well, I think even the chief of IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, said that they may not count on the hostages to be back because of that offensive. And what is really troubling to see is that Israel is probably trying to use the chance of perhaps Donald Trump traveling across Middle East next week and trying to gain leverage with him through putting on this strongman appearance and, even appeasing his plans of the Gaza Riviera that Donald Trump ridiculously, of course, proposed at the beginning of his term. So it all seems like they're capitalizing on each other's madness, but sadly not taking the lives of human beings into account.
Quentin, how big a factor is that looming visit by Donald Trump to the region, which is supposed to be May 13th to May 16th? Israel sort of suggested that they won't have the poor taste to embark on operations negotiations until after he's left. Is there possibly any level at which they're laying this out in the hope that they will allow themselves to be talked about it, or talked out of it rather, or that the United States will offer them something in order for them not to do this?
It really is very difficult to see what the strategy is, particularly when you've got such a principal player as Donald Trump, both ignorant about the region and unpredictable in how he will respond. I mean, at one level, Donald Trump has convinced himself that he's a great peacemaker by making deals. So he will want to somehow be making peace, and he doesn't want, I believe genuinely, he doesn't want the US to get directly involved itself in any of the nightmares of other people's conflicts. But having said that, his response, I think, does tend to be such that it encourages the worst behaviour, both in friends and enemies.
Well, that's the bleaker analysis, Aliona, that Israel has inferred from Donald Trump's general attitude since he was inaugurated, that he doesn't really care about this conflict all that much, that as far as he's concerned, Israel can do what it likes. People may reasonably argue that that is not a huge shift from the previous US administration.
Well, we have to understand that whether Donald Trump cares about it or not, the United States is still a very strong ally to Israel. The American Congress and Senate are still there. The lobby is present, and the United States is the biggest military supply to Israel. So whether Trump decides or not, in short term, the United States will be involved. And as we've seen even over the weekend, so is the United Kingdom and the European allies.
I mean, there's an irony, I guess, if we look at the United States, Quentin, that the air seems to have gone out of this as a domestic political issue in the US, because obviously the people who were most volubly exercised about this, at least on the Palestinians' behalf, tended towards the broadly Democrat camp. But now the Democrats aren't empowered to be protested against. It does seem to have dissipated somewhat.
It does, and the Palestinians certainly don't seem to be getting any significant support really any longer. But very much the protesters are on the back foot, and indeed, as we've seen in the way that Donald Trump has been dealing with the universities, and any sign of protests or pro-Palestinian action in the universities seems to invite immediate sort of cutting off from all federal funding, which is got people, I think, seriously terrified of actually standing up to be counted.
The aid offer that the Israelis are making, Aliona, again, does that seem somewhat theatrical? Both the United Nations and NGOs working in Gaza, to the extent that they're able to, have said that they wouldn't participate in any such scheme as Israel is proposing. Is this Israel, therefore, is this one of those offers that has been made in order to be rejected so Israel can say, well, we tried?
There is a likeliness that may be the case, that it's part of the war diplomacy on Israel's side. Obviously, they want to track carefully what kind of aid goes in, because there were many allegations that some of it is the transportation channels are being abused. But of course, when we are seeing children starving, I think it's time that the international organizations actually get involved and try to resolve the situation.
It is extraordinary to think, though, Quentin, that this war has now been going on for a little over a year and a half, and we still don't really have any idea when or how Israel expects or wants it to end.
Yes, I mean, I think the longer it goes on, the more it does look as if there's certainly a game plan of the more extreme elements in the Netanyahu government who are absolutely clear that they do want Israel to take over the whole of Gaza, and they want to get rid of any Palestinians still living there. And as one of the ministers says today, to emigrate voluntarily. There doesn't look to be anything voluntary about what is happening to them. It is desperation. situation.
Just to follow that up, though, and just finally on this, Quentin, on that prospect of what happens to the 2 million people still living in Gaza, there doesn't appear to be any real ideas about where they would go. I mean, which is to say, nobody so far is volunteering to take them.
No, that's absolutely right, which has been the case all along. I mean, we're actually going back tragically to 1948, the year I was born, which was the year of the Nakba, of the original sort of takeover, and when people started to flee. But those people are still in, second, third generation in refugee camps. It is a terrifying situation.
Well, to Germany now, where tomorrow Friedrich Merz will become Germany's 10th post-war chancellor. His government will be a coalition of his own Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democratic Party of departing Chancellor Olaf Scholz, united in part by a desire to freeze the feral far-right Alternative for Germany, who finished second in February's election, off the government benches. Among the cabinet positions allocated to the SPD are the Finance Minister/Vice-Chancellor role, which will be taken by SPD co-leader Lars Klingbeil, and Defence Minister, which will be kept by the popular incumbent Boris Pistorius. Aliona, first of all, will there be much relief/rejoicing in Ukraine that Pistorius has kept the job?
I think so. Boris Pistorius has proven to be a really good friend to Ukraine, and he was almost in opposition to his own chancellor in the government when he was criticizing Olaf Scholz for not living up to the big Titanwende that they've announced, for not sending enough military aid to Ukraine. So Ukrainians are really counting on Pistorius to deliver on everything he stood for, but even more than that, for Friedrich Merz to up the military aid to Ukraine, because we know that Germany has still not delivered the Taurus missiles, not even committed to them amidst, the horrendous air offenses from Russians. We really need those.
I mean, it's hard to know, Quentin, which is why I'm going to ask you to do it, to judge on how serious Scholz ever was about the Zeitenwende that Aliona invoked there. On the one hand, Germany, I think I'm right in saying, is still second to only the US in terms of military support to Ukraine, give or take the Taurus missiles that Aliona mentioned. But did Scholz turn out to be slightly less serious than he seemed in 2022 when he first made that speech?
Yes, I think it was a classic case of the speech was a great speech, but he didn't deliver. And I think he didn't deliver because he was just rather indecisive and sort of gave up in the face of the problems of keeping a coalition together. And it's going to be a real challenge now for Friedrich Merz if he can do that coalition building and get a really coherent government. But I think the one thing, well, there are two things, I think, going for chances of a better German government this time round. One, both the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats are scared of the same thing at home, which is the Alternative for Germany, the far-right party. And secondly, abroad, they face the real problem of Donald Trump in Washington not being interested in bailing Europe out any longer, while Vladimir Putin is getting away with murder, literally, in Moscow.
I mean, there's a version there, Aliona, of the question about Olaf Scholz, which people were asking 3 years ago, which was, does he really understand how much things have changed and how serious this is? If we apply that same question to incoming Chancellor Merz with reference to the transatlantic alliance, do you think he understands how much things have changed and how serious this is?
I think he does. Having visited Berlin 3 times in the course of the last year and spoken even to some of his foreign policy advisors, it seems like they were really preparing him even in the run-up to the election, including taking him on trips to Kyiv to meet Zelensky, to go to the front line. I think he understands what's at stake in Europe and the need to actually deliver the said Zeitenwende. The only thing that their biggest worry was, of course, aggravating Russia a little bit too much, because Germany is still not quite prepared to face Russia as an adversary were it to attack Germany. I think that's a concern for every European nation, including the United Kingdom today. And B, of course, is the tariffs that Trump slapped on their automotive industry in the face of recession. So they're really constrained by the economic problems that the country is facing.
Now, Quentin, that does bring us to one of the eternal questions where Germany is concerned, and that is this the moment where Germany finally gets over itself? There is this argument, which I think is kind of a reasonable one to make, that Germany over the last 80 years drifted from a country making a very, very commendable reckoning with its own history and, a very, very rigorous attempt not to be that kind of country anymore, to sort of hiding behind its history as an excuse not to get involved.
I remember when I first went to work in Germany, which was back in 1991, being really struck by how pacifist the country was, deeply, and that this was the time of the first Iraq War and so on. Here was a country that absolutely did not want to get caught up in this. And I had a tremendous amount of sympathy for that. I felt that was where they were coming from. I think they've had an awful awakening, really, and there were a couple of really shocking occasions, both of them, funnily enough, in Munich at that security conference. One was when Vladimir Putin, as president early on, came out and ranted about the iniquities of the West and everything. It must have been in about 2008, I think. And then the second one was when J.D. Vance went there just the other day as the US vice president and basically said, we're backing the hard right in your country and you are not democratic. And that was a real shock, I think, to all the sort of fundamentally centrist and rather pacifist Germans of the traditional parties.
Well, on that subject, Aliona, the AfD, of course, in recent days has been classified as an extremist organisation by the BFV, Germany's domestic intelligence agency. This is on top of them being frozen out of government by this grand coalition of the CDU and SPD. Again, understandable enough, possibly all the more so given Germany's history, but does this actually work? Another eternal question where tackling populists is concerned, or does it just reinforce their narrative that the establishment is out to get us?
I think a similar argument was held in France recently when Marine Le Pen was sent to jail, effectively, for some period of time, and is prevented from running for the president next year, I believe. The argument is twofold. On one hand, yes, we're all democracies, and we should provide the political plurality. But on the other hand, when we're living in the era of hybrid wars, and when those political parties are being financed from abroad, which has been proven before for both French and German far-right movements, when they're spreading openly Russian propaganda via Russian YouTube channels operating in Germany, and I've had the displeasure of listening to some of them when I was visiting my mom in Germany recently. You have to understand that intelligence agencies are created there to protect national security, and I think that's exactly what they're doing. And just to follow up on what Quentin was saying about J.D. Vance attacking Germany at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, there was another exchange on social media between Marco Rubio, Secretary of State for the U.S., and the official Twitter X account of Germany's Foreign Office, when they politely have said to Mr. Rubio to not intervene in their democratic processes.
Well, just a final fun thought on this subject, Quentin. How overjoyed should Europe be generally about the prospect of Germany spending 4 years massively rearming, turning itself into a colossal military power at the heart of Europe, and then electing the AfD in 2029?
I laugh, but it's no laughing matter. I don't think it will happen. I actually don't. I do think that sort of German hesitancy will remain, but nonetheless they are in a state of shock, and they're in a state of shock about things they've absolutely taken for granted. One, that they could live with Russia, and two, that they were really allied to America. I mean, the French used to say about Germany and NATO, they are more royalist than the king about NATO. They really believe in NATO, and if Trump pulls the rug out on NATO and says, I no longer will be the last cause of security for Europe, that is really horrifying to Germany. And I don't think that in those circumstances, I don't think the AfD is going to win power in Germany. I think it's that history is too strong.
Well, to Russia now, where preparations are continuing for Friday's parade in honour of Victory Day, commemorating a more successful and indeed laudable invasion of a European country by Russia than any Russia has undertaken or attempted since. Difficulties are being presented, however, by Ukraine, which has buzzed Moscow airports with drones, causing some disruption to operations, and has suggested via its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, that the safety of visiting foreign dignitaries could not be guaranteed. RSVPs in the affirmative have mostly been from the usual suspects: Presidents Xi Jinping of China, Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela et al. But one EU leader has said he will attend, Prime Minister Robert Fico of Slovakia. Aliona, first of all, it's important probably to clarify that President Zelensky is talking more along the lines of Russia staging something and blaming it on Ukraine than Ukraine actually trying any funny business with the parade. But does either of those really seem likely?
Well, if we look back to their so-called victory parade on the Red Square 2 years ago, there were some drones that almost got to the Kremlin. They were struck down by Russian air defense, but nonetheless, some of those drones still speculated to date whether they were Ukrainians or not. Wink, wink. But they got there. And I think in terms of Ukraine's involvement, all bets are off. Unfortunately, Ukraine is defending itself in a way that it can. It's at a massive disadvantage, and the shortage of traditional weapons has led to Ukraine's ingenuity and development of drone systems, including long-range drones. And eventually, if you just don't show Russian population what the war on their soil looks like, including on the days of such public display, vast public display, then the nation will just never know, because they're also blinded by the propaganda.
I mean, looking at this rather, Quentin, from the point of view of those people, those dignitaries, in fact, who are attending, what would be the motivation for going? I mean, doubtless, yeah, they will put on a decent show, etc. But why is that a reviewing stand anybody would want to be seen sitting in just at the moment?
Well, I think you and I might find it very uncomfortable to be there. One does wonder at Xi Jinping going, and, you know, we know that
he has tanks of his own at home.
Yes, absolutely. But you know, maybe at a time they do see that Putin is actually not in a position of a triumphant victor yet. He actually needs a bit of support. Perhaps they actually feel that he needs that. But, you know, if anything happened at that parade, it's a terribly difficult one to calculate whether it might be a triumph for Putin that he could blame Ukraine as terrible, or a disaster that he was seen not to be protecting his own people. And the latter, there is a strong element of the need for that, because he's always presented himself as the strong leader. And actually to have a huge intrusion into Russian airspace, I nearly said Soviet airspace, Russian airspace, in the middle of the big day of the year would be disastrous.
I mean, especially if, Aliona, I guess it was an intervention that was not really so much menacing or actually dangerous or violent, but one which made Russia and thereby Putin just look ineffectual or foolish.
Yes, exactly, because the reason for these parades, for putting on a show, and it makes me think to last year's parade when they didn't even have any tanks on display because they were all destroyed in Ukraine. The biggest reason for that is to showcase the might of the big Russia, the Russian Empire. But effectively, if Ukraine, a smaller country who's been defending itself for 3 years now, if not full 10, can easily get through all of their defenses on such an important day for them, that maybe Putin is not as strong as he would like to be seen, especially here in the West.
I mean, on the subject of the attendees again, though, Quentin, there has been some speculation, apparently mischievous and unfounded, that Robert Fico and Alexander Vučić, president of Serbia, who've both had recent health issues, may have been having health issues in, much the way that people get COVID-19 the week that they're supposed to be at some event they didn't really fancy attending. This is apparently not true. They are apparently both going. But if you are Robert Hlivco in particular, why on earth would you be doing this?
To say to your own population, I'm really in it against that establishment in Brussels and so on, that, I'm a good mate of that strong man in Moscow, and that's a bit like Viktor Orban would be saying too.
Why is that seen, though, as better than I'm the Prime Minister of a country which is a member of the EU and NATO?
Then you need to get inside their heads, and I'm not sure that somebody like Hlivco I really welcome. I do wonder, do you think former President Assad might be up there on the saluting platform?
I'd be very, very worried about high balconies if I was him. Aliona, just finally on this. In previous times, and in fact in your childhood recollections, was Victory Day a big deal in Ukraine?
It was indeed a really big deal. And I was remembering today my great-grandmother who told me all the stories about her fighting in the Second World War and digging trenches first in Donbass and then being captured by Nazis. She was always in Ukraine, but did go through a lot. And my great-grandfather was just all over Europe, having returned home safely too. So that Victory Day was a big deal, but it was always a very sad celebration because as Ukrainians, we always knew that, yes, we were out there fighting the Nazis, but the Soviet regime who sent the people to fight the Nazis, it was as brutal to the Ukrainians and to all of the soldiers of the Soviet Union as it was to the enemy, because if you were to retreat or if you were exchanged as a prisoner of war, you would most definitely be sent to Siberia or just shot dead right there and then because you would be considered a traitor. So there was no illusion amongst any of the actual Soviet, including Ukrainian fighters, about what we were fighting for. It was always the family and our land and not the Soviet regime.
Well, to the opening now of a new front in US President Donald Trump's tariff war with everybody. Perhaps believing that the penguins of the Heard and McDonald Islands have learned their lesson, Trump has turned his attention to foreign movies, which he intends to lumber with a 100% tariff, though, as is reasonably frequently the case with his edicts, it is unclear whether Trump has the authority to do this or how it will work if he does. What can be inferred, however, is that he is confident that his supporters understand that making America great again will not be easy. It is asking a lot of Trump world to forsake the works of Chabrol and Bergman. Quentin, do we have the least idea what is going on here?
No. I mean, when is Donald...
That's the sort of analysis people come to the Monocle Daily for.
When is Donald Trump going to realise that this whole tariff nonsense is actually a terrible own goal, that he's actually going to do far more damage to the American economy than he is to actually getting, investment to come back to America and therefore cheer up his base, his MAGA base? It really does seem to be going the wrong way for him on each of these issues. And, it's blown up in his face when he says, hey, you won't be able to buy your little children quite as many dolls for Christmas, perhaps, because of the tariffs on China. Well, now it's going to cost you twice as much to go to the cinema and watch a good film that, has been made, like a Star Wars style film that's been made in the United Kingdom or in Canada or somewhere else. What about Bollywood films from India?
Well, is that the problem right there, Aliona, that perhaps they're not actually watching good films? Because Trump says Hollywood is, and I quote, dying, and Hollywood has not had an easy time of it, in fairness, these last 4 or 5 years. COVID-19, California wildfires, writers' strike, huge changes in the way people consume media. So is it mostly all of that, or is it mostly because they keep making films which suck?
Well, I think, first of all, Hollywood could definitely try to at least apply some tax reliefs for their film industry, or Trump could start by helping its own American film industry to make some sort of progress before starting banning foreign films being made or them being outsourced to the U.S. One of the most troubling things I think he said along this topic is that we are also trying to tackle propaganda that these films spread, which in Donald Trump language translates to we need to probably ramp up propaganda about American greatness and only make those even more horrific movies about make America great again without any intellectual element to it. I think that's the troubling thing, because we all know that the films are a great educational source and is the easiest for the masses to engage with. And if we're going to start diminishing the quality of those, I think the only way for the whole American nation is only down.
I mean, again, Aliona, harking back to your upbringing in the Soviet Union, do you detect here a sort of Trumpist version of socialist realism?
That's the scariest thing. I feel like I almost have a very sensitive allergy to anything that kind of limits the freedoms and goes down that Orwellian path. And that's exactly what it feels like.
It is kind of amazing, though. There's an overall tendency in the modern Republican Party just to be absolutely horrified, Quentin, by any ideas of actual competition.
The Republican Party is one of the greatest tragedies within America, a tragic sort of... They've been destroyed. They've destroyed themselves. And they simply... I mean, those few members of the Republican Party who are standing up to be counted are fantastically brave, but as the senator from Alaska said not long ago, I fear for my life. And that is a really worrying situation. Just friends who've recently travelled to America, I worry for you, actually, Andrew, next time you want to go. The idea that you have dared to suggest that Donald Trump might like Chabrol or Bergman as filmmakers is so deeply insulting to him. They may stop you at the frontier and not let you through.
Just finally on this, Quentin, I just want to go back to something you were saying earlier about the economic effects of Trump's tariffs, which have not been entirely manifested yet. And is this something that we all should be braced for, i.e. what happens when America understands what has actually hit it? There are reports just over the weekend suggesting that incoming traffic at big US ports is down by a third. That is going to equal more than just a shortage of, dolls for people's daughters. That is going to be empty shelves.
Yes, and the lack of people travelling there and people going there as tourists. I mean, I was seeing ridiculous, the drop in the price of transatlantic airfares because airlines are desperately trying to fill their planes because people aren't travelling there. It's very shocking. I wonder when that will get through. It is perhaps slowly getting through.
Quentin Peel and Aliona Hlivco, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the end of April saw Abu Dhabi host the Culture Summit, an annual global forum convening international leaders from the cultural and creative industries. Monocle Radio sent artist and writer Sofia Hallström to find out more about this year's programme.
Welcome to the Cultural Summit here in Abu Dhabi. I'm Sofia Hallström, and over the course of the next couple of days, we'll be hearing from artists, architects, cultural leaders and visionaries helping to shape the global cultural conversation in meaningful ways. To begin, I sat down with Tim Marlowe, Chief Executive and Director of the Design Museum in London. I asked him what role cultural leaders can and should play in addressing global challenges we face.
So the summit's brought together so many different cultural leaders, and I wonder what you think, what responsibilities do cultural leaders have in addressing global challenges?
It's really because the word responsibility at a culture summit doesn't often come up, and I don't think it should. I'm not unpicking your question. I think creative people have responsibility to themselves. I think that's where integrity and truth and authenticity comes from. But I think you're absolutely right. Cultural leaders, and that means museum directors, it means institutional leaders, but it also means government ministers. And there's over 20 active ministers of culture all around the world here. There's 10 ministers of education, there's 3 ex-heads of state. They have responsibilities. And I think the mixture of us talking about how we might implement change, how culture can change things, needs to be underpinned by a sense of responsibility in getting it to happen. So in answer to your question, I think there's a massive responsibility on cultural leaders to give platform to and to acknowledge the nuance and complexity of the cultural debate in the face of rapid technological change. We can't come up with immediate answers and solutions, but we need, like a lot of creative people, to be agile, aware. We need to listen, and we need to keep responding. And I think that's what a summit like this does. I mean, coming face to face with people from all around the world regularly or annually. You know, there's an argument about why we fly people in from everywhere, how sustainable is that? And there's an argument there, but there is no doubt that people come closer together. They understand people's opinions. They understand difference, cultural difference. They respect it more when they engage.
What approaches do you think that institutions can take to enhance public engagement and participation in the arts?
Well, I think the idea of public participation is key, and I think museums have to look at themselves and understand what's good and interesting about what is effectively an 18th and 19th century model, but also look at what the 20th and certainly, I mean, even the 20th, but the 21st century museum should look like. And museums have to evolve. But the interesting thing is that there is a tendency or a danger that all museums end up trying to be all things to all people and end up being very little to none. So again, in answer to the question, the best thing that museums can do is understand their remit, understand their purpose, have a clarity of purpose, and actually reach out to audiences, listen to audiences, but actually work out how best to engage with the subject that they cover. And you know, there's always this obsession with chasing young audiences, for example. And I sit in a museum, 50% of my audience is under 35, so it's easy for me to say. But there's nothing wrong with an institution whose audience is fundamentally over 50. As long as the cultural ecosystem is serving the needs and interests of different ages, different demographic, different attitudes. And the melting pot where everyone tries to be everything to all people is the problem.
Next, I spoke with Paolo Petrocelli, head of Dubai Opera, about what it means to shape cultural programming in one of the most international cities in the world.
Well, Dubai Opera is a very diversified programming, and it's extremely exciting to work on defining our artistic direction, our artistic strategy. Because maybe, it's the fact that we are speaking to an extremely cosmopolitan community. In Dubai, you have more than 200 nationalities. So when it comes to offer a cultural programming to such a vibrant community, you need to ask yourself, what is culture for Europeans, Emirati, Arabics, Asians, and so forth and so on. And this is really an exciting and definitely, I would say, articulated process, to defining such a very colorful artistic programming. Dubai Opera opened in 2016. We are just about to celebrate next year 10 years, and it's incredible, to see over the last 10 years how many different genres and artistic languages we have actually promoted through our performances and shows. So we range from opera, symphonic, ballet, up to contemporary dance, of course Arabic music, pop, rock, jazz, you name it.
Finally, I speak with Mueller Al-Awwal, an architect whose work spans both Dubai and Japan.
It's such an interesting approach that you have, and I wondered how this global multicultural approach might inform your practice as well.
Yeah, I think, what has informed me a lot being in Dubai and in Japan, Tokyo, let's say, is that both cultures are still somehow clinging to their local identities. Yeah. So you walk around here, you see every local man, every local woman are wearing their Emirati dress, right? And they still have not abandoned their identities to the, let's say, to the standardized Western world, right? And it's the same in Japan. You walk around in Japan, you still see a lot of women walking around with their local attire, or men, etc. And you feel they're still in tune with their identities and cultures. They have not left them behind. But as a Lebanese, I've seen that's gone. If I go to Lebanon, that's completely gone. Yeah, we're no longer connected to our past in that sense. So I think that's why I think being in Dubai, the UAE, and being in Japan, that gives me a lot of thinking it keeps me thinking about, okay, this is necessary. We have to learn from these environments and these cultures how to deal with the environment moving forward. We cannot just say, okay, we let go of all our culture, our identities of the past, and we start anew. It doesn't work like that.
That was Sofia Hallström reporting from Abu Dhabi, and that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Aliona, Hlivco and Quentin Peel. Today's show was produced by Tom Webb. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.